My name is Caitlin, and today I'm going to be talking about binaural cues and sound localization and their relationship to spatial release from informational masking. So first, I'd like you to consider this photo. We have a listener sitting on the table. We have someone talking to him. We also have a speaker playing music from the wall and telephone ringing. So this is a very complex sound environment. The listener is not only receiving sound from the three sources themselves, but also sound that's bouncing off of the floor, the ceiling, and the walls. So it's really important for the listener to make sense of everything that's going on around him. And something that helps him do that is called intraoral or binaural cues. And there are two types of those cues. So consider this speaker, for example. The speaker is playing music that arrives at the listener's right ear a little bit sooner than the left ear, and that's called the intraoral time difference, or the ITD. And the sound is also arriving at the listener's right ear at a little bit of a higher level than that of the left ear, and that's called the intraoral level difference, or ILD. So the brain is able to recognize those differences and cue the listener as to where the sound is coming from, something called sound localization. So we have binaural cues and we have sound localization as a result of those. We also have another phenomenon called spatial release from masking. So consider this image. We have the listener focusing on speech coming from ahead of him, and we have noise to the right side. So in this case, the speech is the target noise, the thing that the listener is focusing on, and the noise is the masker, something that's distracting from the speech. So any gain in understanding of the speech in the presence of the noise is called spatial release from masking. So what we want to know is the spatial release from masking a result of the intraoral cues themselves that are coming from the speech and the noise, or are they a result of the spatial separation, in this case 60 degrees, between the target and the masker? So in our study, we're going to be focusing on spatial release from informational masking, which comes from a situation more similar to this one, in which the target and the masker are similar in sound as well. So the two speech sources are playing at the same time. So any confusion coming from the ears and processing the two at the same time is called energetic masking. But also these two sources are very similar in the way that they sound. So any confusion higher up in the brain in distinguishing the two is called informational masking. So we want to focus on spatial release from informational masking, our gain in understanding of the target source in the presence of the masker source. And is that a result of the cues themselves or the localization difference between the two? So that question can be framed like this. Is our auditory system more similar to figure 1 or figure 2? In figure 1, we have the intraoral differences that cause sound localization, which then facilitates spatial release from masking. And in figure 2, we have the intraoral differences causing sound localization and spatial release from masking individually, and sound localization does not cause spatial release from masking. So this question is particularly difficult to answer because sound localization is a result of intraoral differences. So it's hard to examine the relationship between these two directly. What we did in our study is we degraded sound localization with an algorithm that was designed to preserve intraoral differences. So if we degrade sound localization and spatial release from masking is also negatively affected, then we know that our auditory system works similar to figure 1. Figure 2, however, would be more correct if we degraded sound localization and spatial release from masking was largely unaffected, because this chain from intraoral differences to spatial release from masking is unaffected. So this question has been asked before, but what makes our study different is we are testing the algorithm's ability to degrade sound localization with two different tasks. And also we are focusing on spatial release from informational masking specifically. So we have informational masking and energetic masking, and in complex sound environments, usually both of those are at play. But it's unclear if both of those follow the same mechanism. So if you test a situation in which both are present, it's hard to determine one specific figure because there are two different kinds of masking going on, which could have two different mechanisms. So we're focusing specifically on spatial release from informational masking. So here we have an image of how our algorithm works. So here is an unprocessed sound. It's a broadband sound. In our experiment, we're going to be focusing on intraoral level differences specifically. So this sound has an ILD of about 6 dB across all its frequencies. And this is the sound once it's passed through our algorithm, which is called Locdeg. So the sound is split up into 8 different frequency bands, and the ILD is swapped between the left and the right ears in every other frequency band. So we have +6 here, and then it goes to -6 and back up to +6. So what that does is it disrupts the overall image of the sound, but it preserves the magnitude of the intraoral level difference across all of its frequencies. So what we wanted to do first was test the effectiveness of Locdeg in degrading sound localization. So our first task was playing our subjects 4 sound bursts. 3 were given a negative ILD and 1 was given a positive ILD. And subjects were asked to identify the burst with the positive ILD. So here are results from that study. We have the ILD on the x-axis and the percent correct in identifying the burst with the positive ILD on the y-axis. So each one of these data points is the average of 6 subjects who each tested each condition 100 times, meaning that each data point here represents 600 trials. So as you can see, the unprocessed condition is shows significant better performance than the swapped condition, meaning that our algorithm was effective in degrading sound localization. Our next task was similar in that it tested sound localization. Here is the arc in which it was tested. So subjects were shown this arc and played sound bursts and asked to place the sound bursts on the arc where they heard their sound. So if they heard the sound all the way to the right, they would place it somewhere around here at a higher degree of separation from the center. If they heard it on the left, they would place it over here. If they heard it in the center of their head, they would place it in the middle. So here are results from one subject in this experiment. On the x-axis, we have the ILD played, and on the y-axis, we have the spatial judgment of that ILD. So as you can see, for the unprocessed condition, the degree of separation was much greater than the processed condition. Here you can see the range is from about 80 to -80, and here the range is from about 30 to -30. So for example, if an ILD was played, if an ILD of 8 was played, the judgment was at about 60 degrees, but when the Locdeg algorithm was used and the same ILD of 8 was played, the judgment was closer to about 10 degrees, meaning that the Locdeg algorithm was effective in degrading localization, and more specifically, the degree of localization. So next, what we did was we tested spatial release from informational masking in our third task. So here's our third task. What we did was we played 2 different patterns of noise. So here's the first pattern. And here's the second pattern. So as you might notice, the first pattern has an extra space between the first 2 bursts, and the second pattern has an extra space between the second and the third bursts. What we then did was we played masker bursts in which we interleaved the target bursts. So here is target 1 inside of the masker bursts. And here is target 2 inside of the masker bursts. Excuse me, here is target 2 inside of the masker burst. That was just target 2 on its own. So target 1 and target 2 are readily distinguishable and quiet, but once they're interleaved with the maskers, it is impossible to tell the difference between the 2 without some sort of other cue. So what we did was we gave the target a positive ILD and the masker a negative ILD. So the subjects were asked to identify the pattern in the presence of the masker. The reason that this task tests informational masking specifically is because none of the bursts overlap temporally, meaning the ear has enough time to process one burst before moving on to the next burst. So any confusion between the target and the masker comes higher up in the brain in the form of informational masking. So here are our results from that study. On the x-axis, we have the ILD, and on the y-axis, we have the % correct in identifying pattern 1 or pattern 2. As you can see, again, the unprocessed condition is significantly better than the processed condition, suggesting that when sound localization is degraded, spatial release from informational masking is also negatively affected, even though the binaural cues themselves are preserved. So if we go back to our figures, when we degraded sound localization, spatial release from masking was also negatively affected, suggesting that our auditory system follows a system more similar to figure 1 than figure 2. This question is important. Not only theoretically, it's important to know how the brain works, but also clinically. So spatial release from masking is an important phenomenon in sound. Listening in the presence of other sound is really important in our daily lives. And what this study is suggesting is that sound localization is a significant part of achieving spatial release from masking. So in clinical situations in which someone has lost their hearing, sound localization is not usually tested at all. So this study suggests that perhaps sound localization should have more of a focus in clinical testing in order to preserve things like spatial release from masking, which help hearing in general. So I'd like to conclude with our key findings. The first is that our algorithm was successful in degrading sound localization with ILDs as the primary binaural cue. And the second conclusion is that when sound localization abilities were degraded, spatial release from informational masking was also degraded, even though the ILD magnitudes were preserved. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.